There are probably two kinds of people in this world. Well, two kinds of people in the old world, the one where we used to go to the cinema to watch movies. That is, there were those people who seated with their snacks long before lights went out, and then there were those who bumped their way to their seat in the dark during the opening credits. Only, I'm not here referring to those who are punctual over against the tardy, but rather people's different feelings towards movie trailers and film previews. You see, there are some people who make sure they won't miss any, while the rest of us, and I include myself here, arrived half an hour after the stated screening time on our tickets because we had no interest whatsoever in seeing trailers. This morning, I hope that you're part of the former group. That is, those who prioritized and gave your full attention to trailers, because that's a little bit what this talk feels like. It's not the main thing. It's not the feature. I'm not going to say what I think is in the day. But like many trailers, the thoughts in this talk feel as though they're still maybe in production, but unfinished, under development, and desperate for some great visionary director to pull it all together. Thankfully, trailers usually slip from your memory once the film gets going, and so like them, I'll endeavour to be short this morning. When Lee got in touch to ask if I would be interested, she told me that the artist gathering attracts all manner of art practitioners and art lovers. That's you. I, on the other hand, have been invited owing to my, and here I quote her email again, interest in theology, and literature. That's me. But when I received Lee's email, I spied an opportunity to bridge those worlds, or at the very least to attempt to speak about art using a modern, award-winning piece of fiction, The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. Donna Tartt's novel is named after the 17th century Dutch masterpiece, and the novel could really be called a sustained reflection on the visceral power of beauty, from oil to canvas to the seasonless skies of Las Vegas, and of course, in particular, Carl Fabricius painting. Such a mysterious picture, so simple, says Theodore's mother early on in the novel, as she looks at it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Tender, she continues. It invites you to stand close, you know. All those dead pheasants back there, and then this little living creature. Later, Theodore Decker, the protagonist, he says, when I looked at the painting, I felt the same convergence on a single point. A flickering sun-struck instant that existed now and forever. Only occasionally did I notice the chain on the finch's ankle, or think, what a cruel life for a little living creature, fluttering briefly, forced always to land in the same hopeless place. Towards the end of Tartt's novel, Theo asks, who knows why Fabricius painted the goldfinch at all? A tiny, standalone masterpiece, unique of all its kind. A few lines on, he goes on, why this subject? A lonely pet bird, which was in no way characteristic of his age or time, where animals featured were mainly dead in sumptuous trophy pieces, limp hairs, fish and fowl, heaped high and bound for the table. He goes on to say the anomaly of it haunts me on every level, and this leads to more questions. He asks, why not something more typical? Why not a seascape, a landscape, a history painting? Why not a commissioned portrait of some important person, a low-life scene of drinkers in a tavern? A bunch of tulips, for heaven's sake, rather than this lonely little captive. Chained to his perch, who knows what Fabricius was trying to tell us by his choice of tiny subject? And if what they say is true, that is, if every great painting is really a self-portrait, then what, if anything, is Fabricius saying about himself? The protagonist of Donna Tartt's novel attempts some answers on the subsequent pages, and I'm going to leave them to him or her and yourself when you read it. and also to those more qualified than myself when it comes to art. But alongside or beside these technical and detailed analyses of the painting, Theo's attempts to interpret it in its context and in history, alongside those remarkable passages in Tart's novel, are others. Passages we might call aesthetic, philosophical, or theological. Again, here I'll turn to passages from the beginning, another from the middle, and then an extended view from the close, which I just did, in case you missed it. Firstly, standing before Fabricius Goldfinch in the Metropolitan Museum, again, Theo's mother tells him, "This is about the first painting I ever really loved." And when she was a child, she spoke about being lost, even in reproductions, in library books. "I used to sit on the floor of my bed," she continues, "and stare at it for hours, fascinated." Her first encounter with a great painting in person would have to wait another decade, when she moved to New York, aged 18. "Pure bliss," she recalls, "perfect heaven." And she goes on, "I would be perfectly happy if I could sit looking at the same half-dozen paintings for the rest of my life. And I can't think of a better way to go insane." And though she uses the language of madness and frenzy, she also refers to bliss, to heaven, to the transcendent, which I don't think is coincidental. Because what becomes apparent throughout Tart's novel is that these experiences with what we might call the transcendent or the divine even are premised on at least two things. That is, they're premised on masterpieces, on terrific and great works of art, and on our attention to them, to great works and to our own gaze. Like his mother, Theodore, towards the middle of the novel, expresses appreciation and a tender study of few or even select pieces, rather than the unstudied indifference to many. He also, as he does this, opens up or feels that the transcendent is touching on the present. Even in the act of reaching for it, he says, there was a sense of expansion, a waft, a lifting, and at some strange point, when I looked at it long enough, eyes dry from the refrigerator air, all space appeared to vanish between me and the painting, so that when I looked up, it was the painting, and not me, that was real. Some might explain Theo and his mother's absorption as a kind of mania, forcibly induced, but ultimately empty. The ravings of obsession. We moderns have defenses against notions like the transcendent, against what we might call a second order of reality. We resist the inescapable feeling that there are more than we are, that there is more to reality than what is imminent and empirical. So writes Marilynne Robinson in her essay titled Realism. In full, here it is, she writes, "We moderns have defenses against notions like this one, defenses that in effect preclude our looking without prejudice at what we might as well call reality, since so many of us can attest to it. Now that I find myself elderly, I'm impatient with the artificial limits that we put on our sense of things. In the name of reason, I suppose, or in any case, in deference to what consensus will support is reasonable. Out of this rather narrow consensus is extruded from time to time an interest in mysticism or spirituality, and by my lights this is a siphoning away of attention, a distraction from the quality intrinsic to brute fact, not to mention the numberless categories of fact available to being described in gentler terms. Our realism distracts us from reality, that most remarkable phenomenon. I feel that I've been impoverished in the degree that I've allowed myself to be persuaded on the inevitability of a definition of the real that is so arbitrarily exclusive, leaving much of what I intuited and even what I knew in the limbo of unarticulated and the unacknowledged. I wish I had experienced my earthly life more deeply. And it is my fault that I didn't. Like Robinson, there's so many things we could say about that passage, but like Robinson, most of us can attest to that second reality, to the transcendent, as it presses in on our narrower, reason-laden, flat experiences and more enlightened or empirical worldviews. As Robinson argues, prejudice is really part of the problem here. What we might call presuppositions, and yet she colours our age's waning or fleeting attention. From one favourite author of mine to another, Eugene Peterson picks up on this in his collection of sermons titled As Kingfishers Catch Fire. We live in a culture, he writes, a culture that knows little or nothing of a life that listens and waits, a life that attends and adores. What makes things even more difficult, that we live in a church that knows even less of this life, that makes friends with silence, a life that leaves time and space for the Spirit to breathe into our hourglass lives and form a mature Christian life. The consequences are alarming as our great heritage becomes more superficial by the decade, shallow, trivialized, noisy, glitzy. With God Talk, a few pages on, he writes, this is going on all the time. Mostly all of us need to do is look and listen, touch and taste. Not infrequently our senses, though, we get distracted. We need apostolic help. And if we're lucky, an artist or a writer, a singer, a child, perhaps a pastor shows up with the image or word or song that connects us with the life that is right before us. It is this life, I believe, that Donna Tartt's Goldfinch meditates on throughout. But perhaps nowhere as richly as in the final section of her novel. Hobie, a man who Theo, the protagonist of the novel, ends up working with, he asks, isn't the whole point of beautiful things that they connect us to some larger beauty? Those first images that crack your heart wide open, you spend the rest of your life trying to recapture them in one way or another. Hobie continues, mending old things, preserving them, looking after them. He's in the furniture store. He says, on some levels, there is no rational grounds to it here, connecting us back to that passage from Marilynne Robinson. Yet some of those images, some select masterpieces, Theo muses, seem to open up some much, much larger beauty that you can spend your whole life looking for and never find. On the next page, Theo turns over Hobie's words in his mind. Beauty, he says, beauty alters the grain of reality, but only to add, I keep thinking too of the more conventional wisdom, namely that the pursuit of beauty, of pure beauty, is a trap, a fast track to bitterness and sorrow. That beauty has to be wedded to something more meaningful. Only, he asks, only what is that thing? And it's here that Donna Tartt's novel teeters on the precipice, as her protagonist seems to do throughout the story. Is it a trap? Is beauty a fool's errand? Is it an ontological cul-de-sac? Or does art point us beyond itself to something else? To the transcendent, to what is really real. You see, if there is no meaning, which is Theo's opinion, perhaps Donna Tartt's too, if there is no meaning, then the pursuit of pure beauty, or what we might call beauty with a capital B, can only end, as he says, in sorrow and bitterness. For, in the words of Abraham Kuyper, our being cannot be satisfied unless the thirst for beauty that we experience is quenched. Theo's encounter with the transcendent, with that greater beauty through Fabricius's Goldfinch and throughout Tartt's eponymous novel, is, in the end, shallow comfort and consolation for thirsty souls. Because to take some of those quotes together, his longing for something truly beautiful is ultimately frustrated. And Theo is left unsatisfied. Here's one last passage from Tartt's novel. I'm sorry if you feel like you've read the whole book by now. Don't worry, you haven't. It's quite a sizable work, so 700 pages. On the very last page, Theo celebrates art. He says, whatever teaches us to talk to ourselves is important. Whatever teaches us to sing ourselves out of despair, likewise, is important. But the painting has also taught me that we can speak to each other across time. And I feel that I have something very serious and urgent to say to you, my non-existent reader. And I feel that I should say it as urgently as if I was standing in the room with you. Isn't literature wonderful? He says this life, whatever else it is short. Fate is cruel, but maybe it's not random. He wants to say that nature, here he means death, always wins. But that doesn't mean we have to bow and grovel to it. It doesn't mean if we're not always so glad to be here, it's our task to immerse ourselves anyway, to wade into it, right through the cesspool, keeping our eyes and hearts open. And in the midst of our dying, as we rise up from the organic and sink back ignominiously into it, it is a glory and a privilege to love what death doesn't touch. At the close of the novel, Theo can only exhort us to immerse ourselves in the present and to hear these whispers across time from other people. He can only urge us to not go gently into that good night without suggesting that we rage against the dying of the light. He does urge us against bowing and groveling to fate, with open eyes, open hearts in the midst of our dying. And yet, he concludes that there is nothing transcendent or eternal, no divine reality. How tragic a reckoning it is. How terrible a realization for someone who comes so close, who clutches at it throughout. How terrible that in the end our lives merely amount to loving something we cannot hold on to in death, and something that won't hold on to us either. This is where I depart from Theo's musings, from Tart's world, and rejoice in the one upheld by Marilynne Robinson and Peterson. As Abraham Caper insists, the human experience of being attracted, charmed, and fascinated by something or someone beautiful is an innate longing. And it is a foretaste of the world to come. Art masterpieces like Fabricius' Goldfinch are more than spectacular gifts. For Caper, their beauty helps us to fix our eyes on the beautiful, capital B. So the artist and the musician, the poet, the writer, the filmmaker, the architect, they seek to uncover and disclose lost goodness, hints of restoration, rumours of glory. If this isn't true, well then, as Hobie from Donald Todd's Goldfinch suggests, it is ignoble to spend your life caring so much for objects, corrosive to the soul, quite possibly. He goes on, I've seen too many estates not to know that. Idolatry, caring too much for objects, can destroy you. This is the tightrope that we must walk, all of us. To ignore the hints and the rumours of the transcendence is a mistake and is devastating, but so too is confusing them for the only truly transcendent one. With his typical care, Eugene Peterson is alert to these dangers. In a sermon on Psalm 114, he writes, the created world is wondrous. Together with what God reveals to us through artists, writers, singers, perhaps even pastors. So we must give it our attention. We must study it and adore it. At any moment that we attend to it, he goes on, feelings and thoughts arouse that take us out of ourselves. Feelings and thoughts that very much seem like a prayer. These are so spontaneous and uncontrived, so authentic and unpretentious that there is little doubt that we are in some deeper communion with the reality beyond us, with God's or with God. However, he does warn against returning to those in order to recover the feelings, because what ordinarily happens is that we become more attentive to our feelings and to God and to those objects than the Creator, the transcendent one. We must never forget then, in fact, we must perhaps train ourselves to gaze both long and beyond long in wonder, but beyond in worship. As Henderson writes, I think the quote's up here, behind the superficial forms of beauty, behind sexual attraction and other types of beauty, something deeper and more profound lurks, something for which we were made and have an innate yearning. Developing Abraham Kuyper, he adds, humans were made for art. Art was made for us because the deeper purpose of art is for humans to enjoy and reflect on the hidden glory of God. As I near the end of my talk, I realize I need to say something about tables. It is tempting to emphasize the fact that Hobie from the Goldfinch restores furniture. The kinds of pieces most of us will never set our own eyes on. At one point, Theo remarks that pieces enlivened by Hobie's touch and polished until they looked as if they'd pure golden time poured over them. Copies that made you love Hepplewhite or Sheraton, even if you'd never looked or thought about a piece of Hepplewhite or Sheraton in your life. If I'm honest, I haven't a table in our lounges from at home, but there is another table. A table central to Christian life and worship. And I'm sure recourse has already been made to it and will be over the course of the weekend. In the words of a favorite theologian, Joel Brave, the Lord's Supper is central to our worshipping life as Christians. This is because it is one of the chief means by which God draws us closer to himself. In the power of his Spirit, whom he has sent to proclaim the truth of the gospel, which the supper so eloquently reveals. Distort that and we are lost. Remember it, and we shall find that the Lord's Supper is a blessing given to us by God so that we can ponder, but not only ponder, that we might also experience his love more deeply than mere words could ever allow. Note in that quote how the sacrament is a transcendent moment. It is not merely remembrance or even the gospel word made visible. No, the communion table is where, in Brave's words, God draws us to himself, closer. Indeed, as John Calvin would say, it is here that God condescends to lead us to himself, even by these mere earthly elements. In closing then, we might argue that the Lord's table is given as a guide, not only to God, but a guide to help us navigate the wonders and the beauties of our world. By comparison to these, writes Tony Ranker, I'm almost done, the church's interior spectacles seem dull, but they are beautiful and profound. Each week the local church reenacts the same things: preaching, baptism, the Lord's table, all of them faith-based, repeated, micro spectacles. Yet, these church ordinances are weighted with cosmic influence, with transcendence. In fact, as Reinke puts it over the page, the church is the true dramaturgy of the ages. God has authored the weakness of his people on purpose to highlight the power of his gospel. And in this weakness, the world thinks they see something quite different from what is really being enacted.